Poor black boy pays for elderly couple's meal. Next day, a millionaire shows up at his door. A 14-year-old boy, his clothes worn thin and his stomach empty, walks into a small diner on a chilly evening. His hands tremble slightly as he clutches the few crumpled bills he's managed to scrape together, money meant to feed his sick mother for the next couple of days. But when he sees an elderly couple being humiliated by the restaurant owner because they can't pay their bill, something inside him shifts. Against all logic, against his own desperate need, he steps forward and pays for their meal. What happens? Next, we'll leave you questioning everything about kindness, fate, and the ripple effects of doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. The boy's name is Ethan, and his life has been anything but easy. Growing up in a cramped apartment in one of the toughest neighborhoods in town, he's learned to shoulder responsibilities that no child should ever have to bear. His father left years ago, leaving behind only broken promises and unpaid bills. His mother, Isabella, works tirelessly at 2 minimum wage jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. But even her strength has limits. Lately, she's been too weak to get out of bed, her body worn down by years of exhaustion and untreated illness. That leaves Ethan to take care of both her and himself, juggling schoolwork with late-night trips to the corner store for groceries they can barely afford. Yet despite all this, there's a quiet determination in Ethan, a belief that if he keeps pushing, keeps doing what's right, things might somehow turn around. That night at the diner, though, nothing seems like it could possibly turn around as Ethan watches the elderly couple fumble nervously with their wallets. Unable to cover the cost of their modest meal, his heart sinks. He knows exactly how it feels to be looked down upon, to feel powerless in the face of someone else's judgment. The restaurant owner, Rick, isn't helping matters either. With his arms crossed and a sneer twisting his lips, he berates the couple loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You think I run a charity here," he barks, his voice dripping with disdain. "Either pay up or leave." Ethan glances around the room, hoping someone will step in, but the other customers avoid eye contact, unwilling to get involved. And then, almost without thinking, Ethan finds himself standing up. It's not much, just $20, but it's more than enough to cover the couple's tab. When Ethan places the money on the counter, his cheeks flush red with embarrassment. He doesn't want recognition or thanks. He just wants to make the moment stop. To ease the weight of shame crushing the elderly man and woman, the couple, Evelyn and Henry, are visibly shaken, but deeply grateful. They try to protest, offering to find a way to repay him, but Ethan shakes his head firmly. "It's okay," he mutters, avoiding their gaze. "Just take care of yourselves." Then, before anyone can say another word, he slips out of the diner and disappears into the cold night, his stomach growling louder than ever. What Ethan doesn't realize is that this simple act of kindness won't go unnoticed. Evelyn and Henry aren't just any elderly couple. They're observant, thoughtful people who've spent decades navigating life's highs and lows. Something about the boy's selflessness strikes a chord deep within them. As they sit in silence, after he leaves, Evelyn turns to Henry and says, "We have to find him." There's a fire in her eyes, a resolve that surprises even her husband. It's not just about repaying the debt. It's about understanding who this boy is, where he comes from, and why he would give away the little he has to help complete strangers. The next morning, Ethan wakes up to a knock on the door. At first, he thinks it's probably Mrs. Jenkins from down the hall, coming to borrow sugar again. But when he opens the door, His breath catches in his throat. Standing there are Evelyn and Henry, looking every bit as elegant and composed as they did the night before, only now they're holding a briefcase. Ethan's mind races. Who are these people? Why are they here? Before he can stammer out a question, Evelyn smiles warmly and says, "We came to thank you properly, young man." Behind them, Isabella calls weakly from the couch, asking who's at the door. The tension in the air thickens as Ethan hesitates, unsure whether to let them in or slam the door shut. This visit sets off a chain reaction neither Ethan nor his mother could have anticipated. Evelyn and Henry aren't just kind-hearted retirees. They carry secrets of their own, secrets tied to wealth and influence far beyond anything Ethan has ever known. Their offer to help changes the course of his life forever, but not without raising questions about trust, morality, and the true cost of accepting generosity from unexpected sources. Is this a miracle sent to save them, or something more complicated? And what does it mean for a poor black boy from the wrong side of town to suddenly find himself under the scrutiny of millionaires? As the conversation unfolds, Ethan begins to see glimpses of a world vastly different from his own, a world where opportunities seem limitless, yet challenges lurk beneath the surface. Evelyn and Henry speak of scholarships, new beginnings, and dreams waiting to be realized. But Ethan can't shake the feeling that there's more to their intentions than meets the eye. Isabella, too, grows suspicious, her protective instincts kicking in as she senses the enormity of what's being offered. By the time the sun sets, the small apartment feels charged with unspoken fears and fragile hope. And just when it seems like answers are within reach, Evelyn drops a bombshell that leaves Ethan questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and the choices that lie ahead. To be continued. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to process what was happening. The weight of Evelyn and Henry's words hung heavy in the air, pressing against his chest like a physical force. He glanced at his mother, Isabella, whose hands trembled as she held them tightly together in her lap. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was something else there too. A flicker of hope mingled with fear, uncertainty battling trust. Ethan knew that look all too well. It was the same one she wore whenever someone promised them help, only to disappear when things got tough. Henry stepped closer, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "We're not here to take anything from you," he said firmly, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. "This isn't charity. It's an opportunity. You've already shown us who you are, Ethan. Now let us show you what's possible." His tone carried conviction, yet Ethan couldn't shake the nagging doubt clawing at the edges of his mind. Opportunities like this didn't just fall into people's laps, especially not for kids like him. Life had taught him better than to believe in miracles without strings attached. Isabella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why us?" she asked, her gaze shifting between Evelyn and Henry. "You don't even know us. We're nobody." The vulnerability in her voice made Ethan flinch. It wasn't often that his mother let herself sound so exposed, so fragile. But then again, neither of them had ever been faced with something like this before. Two strangers offering to rewrite their entire lives out of gratitude for a single act of kindness. Evelyn knelt beside Isabella, placing a gentle hand on hers. "That's where you're wrong," she said softly. "You're not nobody. You're survivors. And sometimes, survival looks a lot like courage." She paused, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "Your son gave up everything he had to help two people. He didn't know. That doesn't happen every day. Not everyone would do what he did." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He hadn't thought much about what he'd done back at the diner. It had just felt like the right thing to do. But now, hearing Evelyn talk about it like it was extraordinary, he felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. Pride because maybe, just maybe, he had done something good. Guilt because he hadn't done it for recognition or reward. He'd done it because it hurt less to give than to stand by and watch others suffer. As the conversation continued, Ethan found himself noticing details about Evelyn and Henry that he hadn't picked up on earlier. Their clothes were elegant but understated, their jewelry subtle yet unmistakably expensive. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence that came from years of privilege. Yet they didn't seem aloof or disconnected from the world around them. Instead, they exuded warmth and sincerity, qualities that made it hard to dismiss their offer outright. Still, Ethan couldn't ignore the voice in his head, warning him to be cautious. After all, trusting the wrong person could mean losing everything they had left. Meanwhile, Isabella wrestled with her own doubts. As much as she wanted to believe Evelyn and Henry, the scars of past disappointments ran deep. She thought about the countless times she'd applied for jobs, only to be turned away, the bills piling up despite her best efforts, the nights spent lying awake, wondering how she'd provide for her son. Could these strangers truly change their fate? Or were they simply setting them up for another fall? The tension in the room grew palpable as both sides grappled with their fears and hopes. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "Let me tell you a story," she began, leaning back slightly. "Years ago, when Henry and I were younger, we found ourselves in a difficult position. We lost almost everything: our home, our savings, our sense of security. It was devastating, but during that time, we met someone who changed our lives. A man named Charles, a complete stranger, offered us a loan with no interest, no conditions. He told us, 'Pay it forward someday.' And that's exactly what we're doing now." Her words struck a chord with Ethan. Paying it forward. That was something he understood. It was why he'd given away his last bit of money at the diner, hoping to ease someone else's burden, even if it meant carrying more of his own. But hearing Evelyn frame their generosity in those terms made him wonder if accepting their help might actually be the right thing to do, not just for him and his mother, but for others down the line. Still, the decision wasn't easy. Isabella hesitated, glancing at the envelope on the counter, the one marked with a red stamp declaring their overdue rent notice. She thought about the sacrifices she'd made over the years, the dreams she'd put aside to keep her family afloat. Was it selfish to say yes? Or was it selfish to turn away help when it was finally being offered? Ethan, sensing his mother's internal struggle, reached out and took her hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he didn't have to wake up every morning dreading the day ahead, where his mother didn't have to work herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table, one where he could focus on school, on learning, on becoming someone capable of making a real difference in the world. But just as the possibility of saying yes began to feel within reach, Evelyn dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the small apartment. "There's one condition," she said quietly, her expression unreadable. "And it's non-negotiable." Ethan froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. Condition? What kind of condition? Panic surged through him as his mind raced with possibilities. Had they expected too much? Were they asking for something impossible? Before he could ask, Evelyn continued, her voice firm but kind. "If you accept our help, you must promise to use it wisely, not just for yourselves, but for others, to lift up those around you, just as you lifted us." The room fell silent as the gravity of her words sank in. This wasn't just about escaping poverty. It was about responsibility, about using their second chance to create ripples of change in a world that desperately needed it. Ethan looked at his mother, then back at Evelyn and Henry, his heart pounding. The choice was theirs to make, but whatever they decided, there was no going back. To be continued. Evelyn and Henry exchanged a glance, their expressions softening as they saw the raw vulnerability in Ethan's eyes. The room felt smaller somehow, the weight of the moment pressing against the peeling wallpaper and flickering light. Isabella's hands trembled as she held her son's face, brushing away a tear that had escaped without him noticing. "This isn't charity," Evelyn said firmly, breaking the silence. "It's an investment in you, in your future, in the kind of person we know you're meant to become." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but also filled with hope. Henry pulled out a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket, flipping it open to reveal pages neatly filled with notes and contact information. "We've already started making calls," he explained. "There's a private school nearby. It's challenging, yes, but I think you'd thrive there. And Isabella." He turned to her, his tone gentle yet resolute. "We have connections at a local nonprofit where they're looking for someone like you. Someone resilient, hardworking, and compassionate. You'd be paid fairly, with benefits, enough to breathe again." Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, tears spilled down her cheeks. Silent, but overwhelming, she looked at Ethan, then back at Evelyn and Henry, searching for any sign of deception or hidden strings. But all she saw was sincerity. Two people who genuinely believed in them, who saw value in their struggle and wanted to lift them up. Still, doubt lingered. "What do you want from us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this?" Ethan felt the same question burning inside him. It wasn't just curiosity. It was fear. Fear that this was too good to be true, that somewhere down the line, they'd find out the price tag attached to this miracle. Evelyn knelt beside Isabella, taking her hands in hers. "We don't want anything except what you've already given us, a reminder of why kindness matters. That's rare these days, and it's worth protecting. All we ask is that you use this opportunity wisely, not just for yourselves, but for others. To pass it forward." The room fell silent as those words sank in. Pass it forward. The phrase echoed in Ethan's mind, tying everything together. His act of kindness hadn't been about repayment. It had been about doing the right thing. And now, here were Evelyn and Henry, showing him that such actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he never imagined. Slowly he nodded, feeling something shift within him, a spark of belief igniting where there had only been darkness before. Over the next few weeks, life began to change in ways Ethan and Isabella could scarcely comprehend. They moved into a modest but comfortable apartment, one with heat that actually worked, and windows that didn't rattle in the wind. Ethan started attending the new school, nervous but determined. It wasn't easy. The workload was intense, and some of the students seemed worlds apart from him, but he found allies in unexpected places. Teachers noticed his quiet determination. Classmates admired his resilience, and slowly, he began to carve out a space for himself. Meanwhile, Isabella threw herself into her new job at the nonprofit, working tirelessly to help families facing the same struggles she once had. She poured her heart into every task, knowing firsthand how much even the smallest gesture of support could mean. On weekends, she and Ethan would sit together at the kitchen table, going over budgets and planning for the future. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to dream, to imagine a life beyond survival. One evening, as snow began to fall outside their window, Evelyn and Henry visited again. This time, the atmosphere was lighter, warmer. They brought homemade cookies and stories of their own youth, sharing moments of hardship and triumph that resonated deeply with Ethan and Isabella. As they laughed and talked, Ethan realized something profound. Evelyn and Henry weren't just benefactors. They were family now, bound not by blood, but by trust and shared purpose. Before leaving, Evelyn handed Ethan a small envelope. Inside was a card congratulating him on completing his first semester at the new school, and a check made out to cover tuition for the rest of the year. "You earned this," she told him, her voice steady but proud. "Not because of what you did for us, but because of who you are." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he hugged her tightly, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. When he finally pulled away, he looked at Henry and Isabella, then back at Evelyn. "I won't let you down," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll make sure this counts." And he did. Over the years, Ethan grew into a young man defined not just by his circumstances, but by his choices. He excelled academically, became a mentor to other students, and eventually pursued a career in social work, dedicating his life to helping those in need. Isabella, too, found fulfillment in her work, becoming a pillar of strength in her community. Together, they built a life rooted in gratitude, resilience, and compassion. As for Evelyn and Henry, they remained a constant presence in their lives, cheering them on through every milestone. Their initial gift had been more than financial aid. It had been a lifeline, a testament to the power of human connection and the transformative impact of believing in someone when they needed it most. Years later, standing at the podium during his college graduation, Ethan glanced out at the crowd. There, sitting side by side, were Evelyn and Henry, smiling proudly alongside Isabella. His voice wavered slightly as he began his speech, but he steadied himself, remembering the journey that had brought him here. "Sometimes," he said, addressing the audience, "the smallest acts of kindness can set off a chain reaction that changes everything. Tonight, I stand before you, not because of luck or fate, but because someone chose to believe in me. And now, it's my turn to pay it forward." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ethan barely heard it. His thoughts drifted back to that day in the diner, to the elderly couple whose lives had briefly intersected with his. He smiled softly, knowing that their paths crossing hadn't been coincidence. It had been destiny.